All right, today we are going to be looking at ancient India and kind of talking about the social structure that took place along with the religions that really structured a lot of Indian culture as well. So, the very first group to look at were the Aryans, and what then becomes connected to the Vedic period. Um, you have a various indigenous groups in the area before the Aryans, but the Aryans are going to come in and end up setting up a social structure and civilization that then becomes the kind of foundation for Indian society. What do we know about them? Well, they were Indo-Europeans, which is kind of just a fancy way of saying we don't really know their origin. The Indo-Europeans migrated all over the place. So you had migration and nomadic structure. And eventually, all of them end up settling into different areas. So we'll see some of the Indo-Europeans that break off and settle near Assyria become the Medes and the Persians. In this case, the Indo-Europeans that come and settle near India become the Aryans. And it's really, like I said, it's just a generic thing for, we don't really know their origin because they can't trace like the language origin, and because they migrated so much, it's hard to know like where they originated from, other than you have this kind of vast group of nomadic peoples that seem to spread out and then eventually settle down. So they were nomadic and had been moving around. They were, this particular group of Indo-Europeans that became the Aryans were definitely characterized with horse breeding and military tactics. We'll say technology and tactics. They were known for being good warriors. And this emphasis on warriors will be kind of a characteristic that remains for a while. Well, around 1500 BCE, what ends up happening is that they moved into northern India. And once they moved into this region, they ended up taking over, which was the common tactic of fighting and controlling populations around the area, although never settling down. But that they ultimately took over the agrarian Indian civilization in the area and set themselves up to be in charge. So agrarian, let's see, Indian civilization, and set themselves up. So what was unique about this was really just the fact that they decided to settle down. Well, partially settle down, right? During this period, they still remained semi-nomadic, but they were no longer fully nomadic. And they used the Indian population for farming and the resources that they provided. Right? And then what they did with that is the Aryans, what they focused on was largely raising domesticated animals. So sheep, goats, those type of things. And this was seen as highly prized at the time. And then they supplemented what they needed for food with the labor of the conquered peoples. As far as characteristics go for the Aryans, right? We mentioned already that though they were warriors, but I'll put that one down again because it is important in terms of what happens with the Varnas and caste system. They were also polytheistic. In that they worshipped many gods. They had some principal gods of the sky and storm, but there were other deities as well. They did have impressive weaponry for the time, which makes sense if you are constantly moving around and fighting battles and war, that you're going to have that kind of military component. As they began to settle down, which really then is going to become the later Vedic period, they also established small kingdoms. And this ended up in often warfare, as well as the smaller kingdoms fought each other. And these were ruled by warrior kings. They also created or brought with them the Rig Veda, which is the earliest of the Vedas, which is a combination of a variety of ancient oral epics that eventually get written down. And these give us a good sense of, their belief systems, the structure of society, and kind of the early foundational system of India. So the Rig Veda included, I should say Rig Veda. The Rig Veda was the oldest of the Vedas, and it included the origins of the world. It included religious hymns, so it gives us a sense of their religion and their belief systems that way. It included prayers for life and prosperity. And it also included battles. So we got a good sense of the battles and war that took place. And it definitely was glorified. I would say it was the kind of the best word for that. This was something that was seen as a positive, the fighting, the battles, the success of all of that. And then lastly with this, they eventually completely settle down and become fully sedentary, right? So they moved from semi-nomadic to sedentary, and then that becomes the later Vedic period. Once they settled down, why, kind of the question became why. They hadn't before this, and they had been nomadic initially and then semi-nomadic for a while. So what prompted them? What drew them into settling down? Well, one of the we don't know exactly. They didn't write that down for us, but the belief is that there was new technology that provided better tools for agriculture, which, what's the importance of that, right? Why does that matter? Well, it allows for more cultivation of grains and whatever else you're producing within your agriculture, if I can get that out here. And so this becomes, right, the idea is that this is more productive. And if it's more productive, then it can support their society. Because that definitely is an important aspect of it being necessary. If you're going to settle down, if you're going to be sedentary, you have to have the means and ability to support that population. And so that this area began to look more attractive as a permanent place to stay, not only because of the battles that they had won and began to, as they had fought the various kingdoms that were the Aryan kingdoms, because remember, there's several Indo-Europeans moving around and settling in the area. It's likely that that led to a more unified Aryan system. So now they were a larger, more unified system, plus you now had new technology for tools that made it more attractive for settling down. And then you also have rice cultivation. And rice is important. We'll see this especially with China, that rice provides for a larger population in a denser area. And then on top of that, you had pepper and spices, which not only provide flavor, which is always important. I mean, we are lucky. Our food is very well spiced in comparison to what it used to be back in the day. Food is some foods are very, very bland if you don't have spices. Even just basic salt and pepper makes a massive difference in the taste, and as well as preservation and other things that it provides. And so finding these things can also be super attractive to making food taste better, which creates better food and diet, which creates, of course, a larger population, longer life. It kind of has a domino effect in that sense, and just overall enjoying life better because you're not stuck eating bland food. So we think that these kind of key ideas were part of the reason that they settled down, and again also potentially because they just simply had become, and we'll put that one here, a larger kingdom. And so just by sheer size, it became necessary to create and establish a larger civilization or society in a more permanent basis. The last thing that we're going to talk about with the Aryans is the cultural system that they set up. Now, you have what are called the Varnas, and this is later going to shift to the more known name of the caste system. And a caste system, let's define this, because the Varnas are not quite a caste system. I mean, that's why we're separating out the title here and name. What it ultimately was, first, let's look at the Varnas. It was a classification of social standing, right? It was something that categorized people into social units that did dictate, even with the Varnas, various aspects of life, including your job and social standing. One of the things with the Varnas is it was more fluid, so that there was movement between the categories. When we get to the caste system, there won't be movement between the categories. There was also marriage between the groups. And it was also a way to separate out and really create we'll say a separation between the Aryans and the local population, which was meant, of course, to create a system of control, for sure. It was a way to be able to place the Aryans themselves above those that they had conquered, to establish themselves in a higher position of authority, of importance. So it played a role early on in a sense of kind of controlling and classifying the populations, to be able to set up a social structure, because that's really what it was, a social structure that benefited the Aryans, but also kind of define people's roles within society. Now, again, like I said, with the Varnas, and this is why it's not called, why you have a different name with the caste system later, is the Varnas, there were still opportunities to move up. You could marry someone from a different category. It was not as rigid. It was much, much more fluid in that, which the whole reason that shifts is that the Varnas, there's still a definition of who is Aryan and who is not. By the time you get to the caste system, it has fully become everyone is Indian. There is no separation of Aryan and local populations. They're all just Indian. And then it becomes much more rigid in nature, where you cannot move outside of your caste system. So I'll explain the caste system a little bit more. Actually, let's just do that now, because that way it's clear. So the caste system, so that was all the Varnas. So let's put it here so it's clear that it's a separate thing. The caste system, then, it comes after the Varnas. And then you have, like I said, no distinction of Aryans anymore, right? Everyone is just Indian. But that it's very rigid, and you are born into your caste. So this is the difference between like a class system, right? If we look at class system versus caste system, what you get with this is a class system is based on wealth and have the idea of social mobility. Now, one could argue how much social mobility is actually allowed for the average person. But the point is if you earn more money or you come into more money, you move up into a higher class. You can also move down in class, right? There's social mobility in up or down, essentially, in that aspect. And it's based on your wealth. And I mean, technically, I suppose you're born into a class system by who your parents are and what class they are. But you don't stay in the class based on birth. Okay? So that's the key, is right. It's not defined by birth. That's kind of the key. Yes, technically you're born into a class system based on your parents, but that birth does not define permanently where you stay. With the caste system, it's based on birth and fully birth. There of course were initially job categories with the Varnas, and those stay, but you can't, you're not defined by your caste by what job you get, right? You are allowed certain jobs based on your caste. It is rigid, as I mentioned. There is no mobility. You cannot move up in the caste system or out of your caste. It defines all aspects of life, right? So, and that's something else, right? It does not always, for class, define, we'll say, all aspects of life. Your class can define quite a bit of your life, but it doesn't define everything, right? For the caste system, your job, who you marry, the clothes you wear, the food you eat, where you can live, right? Education, all of these things are defined by your caste. What opportunities you have, everything is based on that caste system, and you have no way of ever getting out of that caste, at least in this current lifetime. And we'll look at what that means when we get to Hinduism in a minute. Okay, so that's the difference, right? The caste system, the fact that there isn't any distinction, everyone's just Indian now. So the upper caste are no longer defined by being Aryan. It's just simply by what you were born into, and then those positions and opportunities that you have with it. And then versus like a class system for the day. So the Varnas was not a class system, but it wasn't a full caste system either, and there was some changes that took place. So I'm going to actually import in an image for this and the caste system secondly. I'll probably just put both in now, so it'll be easy to do. So I'm just going to pause it for a second so I can import in the diagram. Okay, so I added the two images here. The first one is the Varnas, and the other one has the title on the bottom, there with the caste system. So this was the first system. And in fact, there is some suggestion that these two were reversed, that at the very earliest stages of this development, that you actually had, that this was actually the second version of it. And the first version, the warriors were on top and the Brahmins were second. But as you can see, you have clear definition of that the top ones here were Aryan, and then this one here was non-Aryan, and it was used to define those groups. But you had the ability to marry and move around. But you can also see, right, that it defines jobs. So that you have two kind of key things with this. You have the social class, and then you have kind of jobs or your profession that's defined. So in the second version, so let's say, right, and it makes sense that the first version would have the warriors as the top, because that was really the emphasis when they were nomadic and semi-nomadic. When they begin to settle down partway through semi-nomadic, the emphasis on the priest becomes more pronounced. And therefore, as this gets defined, because this wasn't fully defined, even like I said, as we have this structure here, this kind of pyramid, it wasn't fully defined for that kind of whole period in time. It shifts slowly to the priests gaining more power and the warriors, because there's less need, and that totally makes sense. More need when you're nomadic and semi-nomadic and conquering and fighting battles and wars. The less needed are the warriors when you have settled down and have a larger kingdom, because they've conquered the other areas, and so things are more stable and there's less warfare, and so the priests were able then to gain and take more power. So in the second version, right, the Brahmins or priests are first, the warriors are second, the herders, farmers, and merchants and craftspeople are like the commoners, or the kind of upper commoners are third, and then lastly the Shudras, which are also farm workers, servants. So not maybe like landowners, like farmers here would probably be like landowners, and then you have farm workers, servants, and laborers, those who don't own their own land, because the Aryans have taken that over mostly, and are working for other people. And that's kind of the key separation in all of this. And it's the triangle is a good kind of diagram to do this in, because it also tended to reflect the percentage of people in each group, right? So that there were less Brahmins than and then there were more warriors, and then even more of the kind of upper commoners, and then the largest group was the Shudra. So this type of diagram does a good job on kind of reflecting that. And so that was the system. This develops over time to eventually become the caste system. When it shifts to the caste system, right, and that's simply just from settling down, and over time it develops. Right now, everyone is just defined as, with Indians, there's no Aryan distinction. But as I mentioned, it becomes much more rigid. There isn't an opportunity to move out, and this happens, right? Why does this happen? Because during the we'll say with the Varnas, people married outside of the defined group, and you had Aryans that married with the local population, and so then it became less distinguishable between the various groups. Here you have the same order, okay? So that remains the same. The order from the second version to the third, and so we'd really put this as the third version. Okay, so what just to clarify with that, right? The first version is just the swapping of the warriors on top and the Brahmins second. Everything else remains the same. And that was the earliest version. So it's the same order, but no mobility, as was mentioned already. And you have a changing of jobs or roles, right? So if we take a look at some of the changes, the Brahmins are now not just priests, but they're also academics. The warriors are now kings. And throughout time in India, this does, these two, you do have some interchanging where you have some rulers that were in the Brahmin caste, as well as in the second caste. So while the caste didn't shift, you could argue that one of the things that happens with this is that I'm going to move these numbers so I have some space to write here. Is that what you have happen is that besides academics, you actually have rulers that also end up in this one. And while there were some kings early on, right, this became more government officials. All right, and so one of the things to note with this is as much as there wasn't mobility, there is an ever kind of continuing sense of evolution to the caste system, right? So you have the priests are still there, right? It's still the priest, academics, but rulers. Kings early on, and then government officials. Warriors actually goes away, and soldiers end up often in that group. So then you have merchants, landowners, and soldiers. And then commoners for the Sudra, peasants and servants. And so this would often be, farmers could be in both still. So you had farmers in both. It was different, again, types of farmers. There was the land-owning farmers and the farmers that were the farm workers. So they took those off, I think, just because those were things that were there in the previous diagram. But that still was there. So the biggest changes to the job roles were rulers and academics in the Brahmin class, and in the Kshatriya class, government officials being added and warriors being removed, except for some high officers. So we could put officers here. There were some officers in military that would have been in this group, but it was a much more selective. By far the largest group of people in the second caste were government officials. As it evolved in India. You also have a new category, right? If you will, fifth, not categories, a fifth caste, although there's a reason why they have it outside of the system, right? Notice how it is outside of the triangle diagram, and there is a reason for that. So this new group were called untouchables, or Dalit. This is the other name for them. The untouchables is appropriate because it literally was connected to how they were seen. So this was this fifth and lowest caste, but again, it says, outcast, out of caste. They really were seen as, they were their own caste, but they were not worthy of even being in the caste of four. They had to be outside of that caste because they literally were seen as untouchable. They did stuff like it mentioned street sweepers, latrine cleaners, but what also made them seen as unclean were, let me put here just to clarify right with that. You have the untouchables, and with the untouchables, it was literally that they were unclean. because of the work that they did. So street sweeping wouldn't really in itself rise to that occasion of unclean. Latrine cleaners would. They dealt with dead bodies, right? Both human and animal. They also dealt with sewage. So besides toilets, they also dealt with the sewage system. So any kind of job that was seen, I mean, these were necessary things to society. You have to have, a mortician. You have to have someone that's dealing with burying dead bodies. You have to deal with the dead animals, keeping the streets clean, keeping the sewers and toilets functioning. These are necessary aspects of society. But because of these jobs in India, this group of people were seen as unclean and literally untouchable, to the point that people would avoid walking, having an untouchable shadow come across them, because the belief was that if you touch them, even to the point of their shadow touching you, you yourself became spiritually unclean as well. And so that's why they were seen as outside of the normal 4-caste system. They technically were a 5th caste, and yet they were not seen as part of the caste. And this meant that they were shunned from the cities and separated for where they lived. And this created a whole system of slums that still to this day in India exist. And most of the people living in the slums, even though the caste system was outlawed in 1950, still would have been from that caste. And that's important to note, right? The caste system lasted until 1950, right? CE, just to clarify, since we're talking about BCE here, right? In India. And as you saw with the readings that I had you do, even to this day, it has massive lasting impact on Indian society to this day, for which it impacts economics, government, right, and voting and how that works, job opportunities, education, essentially all the things that the caste system limited people or benefited people depending on where you were. It still is impacting that to this day for people. And while there have been laws that have been passed to try to make sure that untouchables or people who are formerly from the untouchable caste are not discriminated against, the reality is that they are. And they've also passed laws to try to give opportunities specifically to people from the slums, from the originally untouchable castes, into universities, into education. But if you live in a slum, what local public education opportunities do you have in that area? Very few. And there are schools, but they're never going to be as good as the ones in the wealthier areas. And most of the families are not able to get out of that poverty. It just is a really difficult thing to do. And so then you get trapped in this cycle that also still includes racism and treatment. And then you have the countryside in India where there still definitely is a more observance to traditional caste rules and roles in society, even though it's technically outlawed. So the cities are better, notwithstanding the slums and living conditions. But as far as potential for opportunities, the cities are going to be better. People don't follow the caste traditions as much in the cities and newer areas of India. But in the countryside, it definitely still is more observed in certain areas. And then, of course, you just have the discrimination and racism that still takes place for those living in the slums, and just the fact that they live there and the location of that, but also what opportunities. In fact, there's a really good movie, Slumdog Millionaire, that is worth watching, that showcases some of those things and how they're still impacting people to this day. Okay, so that's the changes to the caste system, but it goes further than that, because what you end up having is the development of subcastes as well, and these were called jati. And the subcaste, just to give you an idea of how many emerged by the 18th century CE, right? You had over 3,000 subcastes, which is just, how do you even keep track of all of those in that process? And so why? Let's look at just to start, why does this emerge? Well, one, it provides some purpose, I would almost say, and social mobility. Okay, so that you can't move out of your caste. You can't. And so where's the motivation or kind of hope that can emerge from improving oneself and doing better? And so it provides that kind of purpose and social mobility in the caste, because if you have several subcastes, so in the caste system, right, if merchants or landowners or, are higher, which they were, than soldiers and farmers, right, then they end up feeling more powerful, which power was the other thing I wrote for there, and being able to have some control, because that's the other thing. We could put power and control. The lower two, or the lower three castes really don't have a lot of power and control in the larger caste system. It's the first two castes that hold all the power in Indian society. An ancient Indian society. And so subcastes allowed for those lower castes to still have some mobility, some power and control over others in their caste. And you could move, you were able, and we could put that one here too, I suppose, is that you could move up in your caste. You couldn't move out of your caste, but you could move up or down in your caste based on wealth was often a factor. So one of the things is it kind of functioned as a mini class system. It was a hybrid class/caste system. Because if you did become wealthier, if you did end up improving in your job, you could move up. You could have authority over other people. And this structured, the caste system itself structured everything, as I mentioned. But the subcaste also began to establish rules on their own caste, right? So they kind of were mimicking the upper caste, if you will. So where you, even within marriages, foods, right? It was essentially a breakdown of the same things, clothing, and where you could live. Now were somewhat dictated by what your standing was in your caste. If you were in the higher area regions of your caste, you got kind of full access to everything your caste did. Because remember, the two upper castes were able to have foods and clothing and live in locations that the other castes could not have. So then they replicated that in a sense to be able to have some semblance of control as well as probably to be able to feel important in that sense. And this was a self-sustaining entity. And one of the things that we'll look at after we get through the religions is the different ruling groups in India. The reality is that it didn't matter really that much, because the caste system became its own ecosystem that functioned and ran on its own, independent of who was ruling India at the time. As long as they didn't try to change that system, it didn't really matter who was in charge. And that was what was structuring all of Indian society. Only when outside rulers came in and tried to get rid of the caste system or change something fundamentally, then did it create issues and problems. Now, the next thing we're going to look at is Hinduism, because Hinduism was the major and is the major religion in India still to this day. It's one of the longest standing, still actively practicing religions in the world. And one of the things that emerges from this is that it reinforces the caste system and is used by the Brahmins, by the priest. We'll put by the priest to maintain their control. And we see this most obviously when they push back against Buddhism, which is going to come in and kind of challenge the caste system. It was polytheistic. So you had multiple gods, right? And the gods each had characteristics of what they represented. Just as in all kind of polytheistic religions, represented different aspects of life and the natural world. So you had Shiva, the destroyer god, Ganesh, which was the god of kind of new beginnings and ventures. And you did offer the sacrifices, not in the same sense as what we saw with Mesopotamia, but food, flowers, other types of gifts and offerings to the gods. And that you had temples for the various gods. And definitely this was regional some of the time. And you also had, just like other polytheistic religions, local and personal deities, essentially those that were favored by families and local regions. And most of the time this is where then you see the small statuettes, statues of gods in family homes, right? Whereas the larger temples had the larger, more impressive statues for the gods. So the basic aspect of polytheistic religions, right? So how does it and Hinduism also played an important role in we'll say the cultural aspect of India. In fact, a lot of Indian art is influenced and inspired by Hinduism. It also was the basis for one of the Indian political theories. And also was kind of an ever-evolving religion that was reflective of the culture at the time. So, reflected culture of India. Right, the Aryans had come in with a Brahmanism, which was an earlier form of Hinduism, and that evolved through the Vedic era or period, and changed to meet the needs of the people and Hinduism, as it shifted in name, but was just a variation of Brahmism, continued to evolve and shift to the needs of the people at the time. So one of the things that did emerge, though, from this was, well, one, a slow mixing of belief systems of Aryans and local populations that eventually kind of merged into Hinduism in that period. But how it reinforced the caste system. So here I put that at first, but let's put the caste system again, so that I can make that as a separate thing, because I think it's one of the more important aspects of Hinduism is how Hinduism was used in the ancient world to very much keep and maintain the caste system and the order of its structure. So the first part of this is that the belief is that the universe works or is structured on a great wheel of life. It's often called the wheel of life. And it was the idea that we are repeating a never-ending cycle. And from which you have life. Well, actually, first, I suppose, birth, life, death, and then it repeats, and this is reincarnation. So their belief was the system that the soul is immortal, right? You have, for reincarnation, right, the soul has to be immortal. And while the individual dies, the soul does not. It just gets put back into this wheel of life. And so, of course, this means that we have past lives based on our soul. And while you are not identical to your past life, you are connected to it. Your current one is connected to it. So that's the first part of it. How that's going to reinforce this, that gets into the second part, specifically looking at two ideas, karma, and then we'll look at dharma next. So karma is connected to this idea of essentially order and righteousness in life. And this idea of really that justice is built into the universe, or I guess is inherently part of the universe. And so there is this moral dimension to reincarnation. And that moral dimension of reincarnation is based on how you live your life and impacts the next life. So karma essentially is that there's good karma and bad karma, right? You get good karma by doing good, right? Living, there we go, rightly and justly, and you gain these essentially points, right? You gain good karma over your lifetime. And then you also have that there is bad karma when you do bad things. And this doesn't have to be big things, right? For either one of these. This is both big and small things, right? It's not like just massive good deeds or massive bad deeds. That everything, when you put that for here, everything goes into either good karma or bad karma, right? Your actions and behavior either rack up good karma, I forgot the word karma there, or bad karma. And why this is important is then essentially the belief is, right, that the good and bad deeds, your good and bad karma are measured or tallied when you die. Right? And your soul is not quite put back into the wheel of life. So if you had this wheel, okay, and it's usually shown with spokes, kind of like what you do have on a ship, the ship's steering wheel, right? What do those look like? Like that? There you go. Okay. So you have the wheel of life. Oops. It's been way too long drawing this here, but that it's usually displayed kind of like I said, it always reminds me of a ship's thing a lot of the times when it's shown. They also had one that was a more elaborate system, and then kind of that you had the spokes and everything else in the center, which could be connected to the spokes of life, the different threads. Anyways, you have this wheel of life, and in the wheel of life, right, you have birth, your life, your death, and then your soul, right, is in the individual person through all of this. And then it's kind of like with death, your soul goes up here, where then your karma is judged and justice is rendered when, after your karma is judged, you go back, your soul is put back into the wheel of life, right? And this is based then on if you did a ton of good karma. So good karma gets rewarded in the next life. Right? Whereas bad karma, if you have more bad karma than good, gets punished in the next life. Right? So if you do a bunch of good deeds, and what's the reward or punishment, right? It was connected very much to the caste system. If you the idea was if you got a lot of good karma, you could move up in the caste system in your next life. Of course, never in the current one. But in your next life, you could move up to a higher caste. Likewise, if you had bad karma, right, you moved down the caste system, which was seen as worse, in the next life. And there was neutral, right? It was not always a up or down. If you were pretty consistent and average, you just stayed in the caste you were in. So this, why is that important? How does that reinforce the caste system? It justifies your current position in the caste system. So the idea being that if you were a lower caste, well, you deserved it because you obviously must have done bad things in your previous lives. If you were in a higher caste, you deserved it because you must have been really good in your past lives. And therefore, if someone wanted to argue or challenge the system, it was hard to do because Dharma, or karma, we're getting to Dharma next, karma reinforced the position you were in, right? And it also, so that's one of the things it did. The second thing it did is it encouraged you to look for change in the next life, right? So don't think about moving caste or changing the caste system in this life. You can move in the next one, right? So this is temporary. You're in this caste now, but that's okay. One, you deserve to be in the caste you're in, but two, you have an opportunity to improve your situation, not in this current life, but in the next life you do. And so in those two ways, it reinforces it. Then Dharma comes in and it also reinforces the caste system. Dharma was one's duty. Right? So this was the idea of duty of being specifically, we'll just make the list, I won't number them here, like a mother, a child, your job, right? Whatever your job was in your caste, in everything, following the rules and laws. Essentially, in every aspect of your life, you had the Dharma. You had a Dharma of being a mother, the Dharma of being a child, the Dharma of being a husband, of being a farmer, of being in whatever caste you are in. So this idea is that you, the more you followed your Dharma, right, you followed your duty, the better karma you got. So in this sense, and the opposite held true, right? The more you didn't follow if you failed to follow your Dharma, then you got bad karma. Okay, so in this way, it prevented people from challenging the caste system. It prevented people from, it essentially set up in Indian society a series of obligations to one's caste and the system as a whole. And if you challenge that, if you said, maybe it needs reform, maybe we should, look at other ways, this seems bad, then you get bad karma, and then you're going to move down the caste in your next life, and you're screwing yourself over in future lives. But if you follow your caste, if you do your duty as an Indian citizen, as a Shudra, as a mother, as whatever else, then you're going to get a lot of good karma, and that can help you move up. So you have this kind of coalition of reinforcement, and then lastly, how it reinforces it by really the Brahmins themselves, right? If you look at this system, who gains the most, all the way back here, right? Who gains the most from maintaining this system? Well, really the top caste. The two top castes live pretty well. But who could reinforce it the most would be the Brahmins, right? The priests, because then they could reinforce, which is what they did, highly ritualized roles that kind of entrenched this idea of their purpose, as well as making it difficult for other people to understand what they were doing. That it was something that was exclusive to them and connection to the gods. Right, so they had connection to the gods, and this is the way that it was supposed to be. And then they constantly reinforced karma and dharma. And in this way, it keeps them in control these kind of actions here keep them in control. And everyone else in their place. So, like I said, Hinduism was really kind of this perfect establishment to reinforce and prevent people from challenging the caste system. Now, we'll see with Buddhism, there is a challenge to it, but it definitely was not common. Okay, so that brings us to other religious beliefs. There's one I'm just going to mention briefly, and then we'll look at Buddhism, right? The one first is going to be Jainism. Jainism believed that, so Jainism was different than Hinduism, and yet it closely followed. It was just kind of more like an extreme version of it. And so Jainism essentially believed that everything, and I mean literally everything, had a living soul. Essentially, everything was alive. Right? Everything was essentially alive or had a living essence. Okay? And this meant that everything you did in life was essentially killing something. And again, I'm not just talking about like animals. There definitely was a hierarchy to things, to everything. So there was, people and animals had more value. Than plants and rocks. But the point is that everything still had this living essence to them. So breathing, walking, talking, bathing, building a house, all those things are killing this part of those living essence. Because even the particles in the air were living things, and so every action of your life was killing something. So what's the purpose then? Because of course killing equals bad karma, and they still believed in reincarnation, and the caste system and all of that. So your goal is to limit the amount of damage you did. Now, there's the non-practical side of this, or most extreme, which were, I suppose, the monks. And they, essentially, their goal was to sit in one place, not move at all, and breathe as little as possible. Your goal was to minimize the amount of damage you did. So the most extreme form of that is you had Jainist monks that would sit on the side of the road and not move. They would eat as little as possible. They would do as little as possible, because the less and less that you did, the less things you killed, and then the less bad karma you racked up. The more traditional, the main way, let's call it the main way that people practice this, was through moderation. One of the things that Jainists often did is that they wore a cloth mask, as it was believed to at least prevent you inhaling some of the particles. You killed less particles, right? And then it was just being aware of all your actions, right? And the fact that everything killed, and picking wisely. They definitely were also the vegetarian, because killing animals to eat them was a much larger ding of negative karma, bad karma. So you didn't do things in excess in Jainism, and Jainism is still practiced to this day, and that is still the philosophy: moderation, being aware of how you live and how it impacts things, right? Am I being destructive for no purpose? They acknowledge, yes, we have to live. Unlike the monks who, there was one story of a Jainist monk who basically became mummified in that position and died. They just slowly withered away from not eating and drinking, and their body became emaciated and dried up to which they looked like a living mummy. And in fact, there's still references to this day. The best example I can think of is actually with the Switch game Breath of the Wild. They have those essentially mummy-looking monks that are in that position until Link, goes and touches the thing and wakes them up. But they also found like the remains of a monk who was still in that sitting position and died in that position and was somewhat mummified. And the reason being was because that they were already somewhat self-mummifying before they died from lack of water. They dehydrated themselves to everything, shrunk up. They weren't eating. And then they simply died in that sitting position of meditation. That is the super extreme form. And there was recognition that most people weren't going to follow that. And not that all monks killed themselves. There are others that was their main thing they did each day, was limit what they did. It didn't mean they didn't eat and didn't do other things, but you spent as much of your time could sitting quietly, meditating, and avoiding killing things. But the much more practical one that's still practiced today is just the idea of that you're aware of how everything you do has a consequence. And that living in moderation and being aware of the clothes you're wearing, the house you live in, your activities that you do, you're making a choice every single time to cause damage. So how do you minimize that damage where you can, while still being able to have a life? So Jainism is an interesting one because it's kind of this extreme version of a karma and dharma, essentially. But this one, why it's not mentioned as much, and one, there's not as many followers as Hinduism and Buddhism. The other reason was that, and why it wasn't controversial during the period of ancient India, is it didn't challenge the caste system. Nothing about Jainism challenged the status quo. Buddhism, on the other hand, does. All right, unlike Hinduism, Buddhism has a founder and a starting point. The founder was Siddhartha Gautama, who became the Buddha. And so this is around 563 to 483 for when he lived. Now, he was either an aristocrat or prince, and the story goes that he was sheltered. So there was, here we'll put it, we got the two diagrams or two lists here that I added. So there's a story of how he became the Buddha. And the first was that he was sheltered all his life. His father didn't want him to have any suffering, any pain, and so he was and was given everything. And what happens is in the story is that at one point, when he was going out to inspect the lands, he experienced, well, it almost experienced, he saw suffering for the first time. And in one of the stories, it was through 4 different people. And this made him realize that the very last person was important. The very last person was this older man who, even though he was old and frail, he was filled with joy and happy. And this created a desire in Siddharth for this idea of fullness of life, of wanting to, he felt like his life was empty and hollow. And that although he had everything he could possibly want and never experienced anything, awful, that he wasn't happy. And so he goes on a journey, essentially, of self-exploration. And his first attempt at that was to deny himself everything. Extreme asceticism, essentially. He felt like if he, that he had to get rid of desire and unhappiness, he needed to, kind of be like that, the monk or the old man who had nothing and yet seemed happy. And so, he went and he kind of went on the extreme asceticism. So extreme, he went from extremes, right? From everything to nothing. But as he experienced this, he found out he was still not satisfied. There was still desire. There was still, he still wasn't happy. And so then the story goes that when he was meditating, he finally came, he became enlightened. And when he became enlightened, that he came to a realization of the kind of meaning of life and how to achieve enlightenment, which becomes the end goal. And that is where he came across the 4 noble truths. Okay, and that's these here. The 4 noble truths. The first one is that to live is to suffer, right? Or what they have, the nature of suffering. Just to be alive, you're going to suffer. And the second thing then is that suffering is caused by desire, right? Which is what he ended up having after experiencing suffering and then seeing the old man. But ultimately that when he went to the opposite extremes, that in itself didn't cure that desire, right? So first, that everyone suffers in life. To live is to suffer. Then suffering is caused by desire. But that suffering can be overcome. Specifically that you can achieve nirvana, which is the ultimate enlightenment. And the way that can become overdone is through the Eightfold Path as the solution to suffering. So the main tenets of Buddhism starts with the 4 noble truths. And then the 4 noble truths, the last one then leads to the Eightfold Path. And the Eightfold Path is the path to nirvana. And nirvana was the way to end the cycle of reincarnation. Essentially, the end goal was to get out of that endless cycle because life was suffering. And only when you achieve true enlightenment were you able to, and achieve nirvana? Were you able to end that cycle on the wheel of life? And with nirvana, with that idea, is essentially you wanted, the Eightfold Path was the way to achieve serenity of the soul, and true fulfillment, right? And that the other principle that he had was that anyone could become a Buddha and achieve this. And this, we're going to come back to this, is where it begins to challenge. So we'll put that here. This is going to be the challenge to the caste system. Because he's not fundamentally going against the idea of reincarnation and the wheel of life. That's still the same. And there is this sense of karma and dharma that does still exist. Instead, it's the idea of the whole focus is on how to achieve end desire and suffering. If you end desire, then you end suffering. And if you achieve full serenity of your soul, then you're at harmony with nature and therefore have achieved nirvana. And therefore there is no purpose for continuing in this cycle of the wheel of life. So the Eightfold Path is this here. And it's right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right concentration, right mindfulness. And then they have underneath, right, just says knowing the truth, freeing your mind of evil, saying nothing that hurts others, work for the good of others, respect life, resist evil, practice meditation, control your thoughts. And again, it's kind of this sense of moderation, right? He tried extremes and it didn't work. But it's through moderation of knowing how to, speak properly and not hurt other people, to work for the good of others, to respect life, to not have these extremes in these 8 ways, and actively practicing these in your life, right? That was the idea with this, is that you had to actively practice and live these if you wanted to achieve a sense of peace and serenity. But if you could, then you could eventually achieve nirvana. So that's the Buddhism. After the Buddha dies, it does split into 2 groups, because they break into his followers break into disagreements about what's the best way to practice Buddhism. You have Theravada, and I won't test you on this part, but that's the stricter version, which focused on monastic life for both men and women. So that's one of the things that we'll put, let's see, we'll put here 3. Challenge to the caste system. 1 was the idea that both men and women could be monks, right? Or could be part of the monastic life, right? The nuns and stuff, or the Buddhist nuns, that reading. The other thing is that all people were spiritually equal. So in this sense, right, any caste could become enlightened, become a Buddha, become enlightened, and obtain nirvana. Right? So this directly challenged the Brahmins in a sense, and the order of the caste. Because you could be, you know, an untouchable, you could be a Sudra, and then Buddhism was saying everyone was equal spiritually. Now, they didn't directly come out and say the caste system was wrong and no one has to follow it, but the idea that anyone could essentially become like what the role of the Brahmins was, as the priest in Hinduism. Everyone was spiritually equal. Everyone, even the lowest person on the caste system, had the ability to achieve nirvana. That directly challenged the caste system, and also allowed women actually to challenge the patriarchal system, because they could not only become part of the monastery within Buddhism, but they could also, in doing so, stop following the patriarchal system of one's dharma. Because what happened is that Buddhism, their sense of dharma for Buddhism was different than the Hinduism sense of dharma. Dharma to one's caste, to society, versus dharma to one's soul and the attempt to end suffering and desire. Right? And so it was a more personal dharma than to society. And so if you were no longer bound by that dharma of Hinduism, then you were no longer bound by following your husband in the patriarchal system that India had set up. So it also definitely changed the role of women who were part of, who practiced Buddhism, right? If it didn't change the role of women who were still in Hinduism and didn't practice Buddhism. So this wasn't a massive cultural-wide systematic change because of that. But it did get pushed back. The Brahmins actively worked to stop Buddhism and the spread of Buddhism. It's why it actually spread. You had Buddhist monks that went to China to share Buddhism, and it actually spread there because it didn't go against their philosophies in any way. And so people often think of Buddhism with China more so than India, because there was continued an active resistance to having Buddhism spread. Okay, so the last thing we're going to look at, I think we're on 4, sorry if the numbering system is off, is women in India. Right, I had you look at 3 readings, primary sources, which showcase this: the Laws of Manu, the Buddhist nuns, and Savitri and the God of Death. And I think these do a good job of showcasing the various, you get very different perspectives of women. And that really that it showcases that India had a more diverse sense and role of women than some of the other societies, right? And so in the Laws of Manu, right, you have a much harsher, let's see, I guess we'll write these again. So the Laws of Manu, you have a more patriarchal, strict patriarchal system. That's very clear. And we'll look at these in just a second. So a strict patriarchal system where women had very little value and were very much connected to their husband, right? They were under the authority of their husband, which we can see with the one line where it says a woman must never be independent. And so we'll look at those in just a second. But think about, right, how this is connected to Aryan culture. Right? One of the questions I ask you is why are they different? Well, this is part of that. The Aryan culture was based on a system of, right, warrior society, It was also older. And so you had this more, anytime there's a warrior-based system of society, women's status goes down. Because, right, the value is warfare. And ultimately, if women aren't participating in that, this is going to create a more patriarchal system. And so we're going to see reflected in that very limiting and negative role of women. So we'll say negative and limiting roles in the laws for women. Okay, and then for the Buddhist nuns, right, you think about what you have. One, what's significant about these is that they were written by women. In the ancient world, we don't have a lot of documents where women were actually writing things. There were things written about women, but written by men. So to have actual women's voices writing is very helpful in getting an idea and a sense of women's roles and position, which also, right, this is attached. Why is this different? Why is there a different view of women where this one was definitely more equal? And almost seems celebrated, right? Well, because Buddhism allowed for that transition and change. Because in Buddhism, right, women were spiritually equal. And it allowed them, we'll put here, allowed to not follow traditional roles of society. So again, right, why is it different? There's some of the reasons right there. And then lastly, Savitri and the god of death. This one is interesting. I really like this story. I think it's a fascinating story. Because we get a sense of women's roles and this duality. So one of the things that definitely impacts why there's different views of women, think about Savitri. Savitri is a princess in the story. So she was of the highest or higher class. And in India, women of the higher caste, I think I said class there, but women of the higher caste had more freedom and rights. Now, that's not always the case, but in India it was. And so you see that she is praised for characteristics that are clearly not praised in the laws of Manu. Right? Intelligence, cunning. She's given choice and agency in what she chooses to do. And so, yeah, having that freedom to make those own decisions and having women of the upper caste have it. So again, the answer to the question of what is going on in India that creates such a diversity in perspectives of what role women's roles were. Well, you have the caste system that plays a role, religion that plays a role with Buddhism, not so much Hinduism as Buddhism. And then the earlier period, pre all of this with Aryan culture and a warrior status creates a much stricter patriarchal structure. Always. Okay, so let's take a look at these here. The laws of Manu, Again, this was during much closer to within the Vedic period, and connected to certainly still that Vedic structure and Aryan structure. So it was older, and the Brahmins, and that's another thing too. If you think about with Buddhism versus Hinduism, is the Brahmin priest had written the part of these laws of Manu. And certain reinforced some of these ideas and concepts of the roles of women. Right, so this first one, it's that in childhood a female must be subject to her father, in youth her husband, and when her lord is dead, to her sons. A woman must never be independent, right? That's that strict patriarchal structure. Whoa, no, I don't want to download that. That a woman is never independent. She is always under the authority of a man. And I mean, look at this description of women. Though destitute of virtue or seeking pleasure elsewhere or devoid, or this is a description of a man and what the women are supposed to put up with. Though destitute of virtue or seeking pleasure elsewhere or devoid of good qualities, yet a husband must be constantly worshipped as a god by his faithful wife. So this basically is saying your husband can be a complete horrible person and you still need to worship him like a god, because that's your role as a woman, as a wife. A virtuous wife who, after the death of her husband, constantly remains chaste, reaches heaven, though she have no son, just like those chaste men, right? So this is definitely no remarriage at all. In fact, it says, right, a woman who finds desire to have offspring violates her duty towards her deceased husband and brings disgrace on this world and loses her place with her husband. The whole view of widow was very negative. It was a bad thing to be a widow. In fact, there was a practice called sati, which was the ritual suicide, which eventually was outlawed. But it was the idea that when a woman's husband died, that she was to throw herself on the funeral pyre, kind of with the belief that essentially she had nothing left to live for, and the most best wife was the one who was willing to follow her husband into death. And widows were seen as bad luck. They were shunned from society often at times. It put them in a really poor position, especially in the earlier periods of ancient India. As India continues in ancient India over time, that practice gets banned, and women do end up with more roles and rights in society. Here is one area where having different groups in control does play a role in that women's role, right? And this was one thing that they were outside rulers were allowed to tweak some, is that you do have certain outside rulers that gave women more rights, and since it didn't technically challenge the caste system completely, it was allowed. But for in early ancient India, women were viewed as in this strict patriarchal structure, and being a widow was super negative. You were not to remarry for sure. And right, a wife, a son, and a slave, they are declared to have no property because they belong to their husband or to the man, right? Right, it even mentions again, nowhere is the remarriage of widows prescribed in the rules concerning marriage. And then also just, this is unfortunately very common in the ancient world, is that very young girls would be married off to older men. And that was seen as, because women were a commodity, right? That's really all that they were seen as. So we see with the laws of Manu, right? Women had really crappy positions in India. What I want to make clear with this is that this was not the only position, and it changes. So while women definitely had this kind of harsh structure of strict patriarchal structure in ancient India, throughout the period that we've been looking at, that's obviously clearly not always the case.
So the laws of Manu do not stay as the full practice. Now there are lingering effects we'll see with Savitri and the god of death. But the idea is it didn't stay that strict and that awful the whole time. Okay, so then you have the songs composed by a Buddhist nun. These are celebrations, right? It really was a sense to celebrate. So free am I, so gloriously free, free from three petty things, the mortar, the pestle, and my twisted lord. Right? This is very much like that patriarchal structure. The mortal and the pestle were, kitchen tools, and then her husband. Free from rebirth and death am I, all that has held me down is hurled away. Right? So that sense of free from the rules, free from the structure of society. Okay, and then you have the next one, a woman well set free. How free am I? How so again, celebration of being free. We get that word free. How wonderfully free from kitchen drudgery, free from the harsh grip of hunger, free from the empty cooking pots, free too of that unscrupulous man. Calm now and serene am I. So that looks like, connected to it's definitely connected to the Eightfold Path here and Nirvana. And then this one's at old age. Though I am weak and tired now, and my youthful step gone, right? So she's talking about being old. Leaning on the staff, I climb the mountain peak. My clothes cast off, my bowl overturned. I sit here on this rock, and over my spirit blows the breath of liberty. I've won the triple gems, the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha. The Buddha's way is mine. Right? So what we see here is a celebration of freedom by these that were written. These kind of poems of the Buddhist nuns is this celebration of freedom. This gives the impression that women had a lot more rights and freedom in India, which they did through Buddhism. Okay, but that was also very limited because most women in ancient India were not Buddhist nuns, or were not very active Buddhist or even Buddhist at all. So it is important to recognize that this was still limiting. Then you have Savitri and the god of death. And this story is interesting because it definitely feels like there's a dichotomy between two sections. One where it talks about, and I went over this story, so I'm just going to go over this really briefly, that you have the princess Savitri. She was the only daughter, and she was beautiful and intelligent and no one dared marry her. So the king asked Savitri to choose a husband for herself. So you have now characteristics that are being praised in this story for women of being of intelligence, and agency, right? That she gets praised for intelligence, she gets praised for cunning, and she gets agency to make her own decisions. She really is independent in this story, right? These are all characteristics that if you were just coming off the laws of Manu, you would think were never possible. And yet here they are. Even the relationship between her and Satyavayan, who she ends up marrying, is very positive and mutual loving, which is the opposite of the laws of Manu. And again, it's why I picked it, to show you that there was a variety of views of women's roles in ancient India. So she ends up traveling and she finds Satyavayan, him and his father, who they were king and prince, but had lost everything, and his father was blind, and they lived like hermits. She decides she wants to marry him, and but seeing Satyavayan's horoscope, the astrologer says he will die 1 year from today. So right, of course, there's that fear of being a widow, because her father's like, oh, you can't marry him, right? Because being a widow is awful. But she says she still decides, nope, I'm going to do it, right? So again, even with this fear of for his daughter being a widow, he lets her choose. And so she ends up marrying Satyavayan, and it says they lived happily for a year. But then, his death is coming, and so she follows him to make sure she's there when he dies. And when he dies, the god of death, your Lord Yama, shows up, and he catches the Satyavayan's soul and takes him towards his kingdom. And he consoles Savitri by saying Satyavayan was a good man of virtue, and happiness awaits him in my kingdom, right? So he's going to have a good afterlife. She doesn't say anything. She just follows the god of death. And he says, you can't follow me, and then, I know you are doing your duty of taking away the soul of my husband. That's what she says to him. But my duty as his wife is to stay beside him. This sounds an awful lot like the sati, the ritual suicide. She may not be throwing herself on a funeral pyre, but she's following his soul to the afterlife and saying that that's her duty. And yet we have these opposite descriptions of a woman who's intelligent, who has agency, who is cunning, right? It's definitely the dualistic view in this story. And the Lord Yama contradicts this. Your duty is over with the death of your husband, right? So that's more progressive. And so he says, but because of how good you are, you get a wish. But you can't wish for the life of your husband. So she asked for the restoration of the kingdom in sight of her father-in-law, right? So the idea that the men are put first over her own needs or wants, right, is also reinforced in the story. And so Lord Yama thinks, great, I've given you a wish, now go home. But instead, Savitri continues to follow, ends up bleeding, and he says, you've come far enough, now go back. My husband will find happiness in your kingdom, but you are carrying away the happiness that is mine. This one's more positive, right? Not that it's her duty as a wife to follow him to the afterlife, but because she doesn't want to leave him in the happiness. I admire your devotion. Again, though, still somewhat reinforcing following your husband into the afterlife. But you can't come with me. I'll give you one more wish. Grant many children to my father. I was his only child. And so again, first it was to the father-in-law and then her father. And then he begins to climb a steep hill. When Yama looked back, he saw Savitri coming up the steep hill, tired and exhausted. Savitri, I forbid you to come further. So then he says, this is the last time. One last wish. Can't wish for the life of your husband, but we're done. You will not be allowed to go further. So she says, grant me many children and let them be the children of Satyavayan. He was surprised by her wit and strong will, right? So there again, praising wit and strong will in a woman just seems like the exact opposite of what we saw in the earlier source of the laws of Manu. But again, remember, these were written at different times. The laws of Manu were very early. Savitri and the god of death was in a later period. And so he's like, I can't give you the wish without releasing Satyavayan. And so Satyavayan ends up getting his life back, and they have many children, and they live into old age, and the father gets his kingdom back and their wealth. So it's that everyone lived happily ever after story. But I really like this story. It's a fun story. It's also a very interesting one of how it's kind of dualistic in what is women's roles. We want to praise her wit and intelligence and give her agency, but we also want to reinforce women's role and duty to their husband. And we're going to praise her devoutness to her husband and how she was willing to follow him into the afterlife. So you get this dichotomy, right? But ultimately, that you're seeing the different roles. And of course, that caste plays a role here. She was of a higher caste. Women of a higher caste in India had more freedom. There was one other thing I forgot to mention, and I'm just going to write it real quick because it's good to know the order. I mentioned, right, that we'll put this for political structure. The political structure of rule, just to give you a sense of how it was, right, this, again, the Aryans played an important part because they established the Varnas and caste system, essentially, and they set up the foundational stuff. So those rulers were important. And they structured a lot of India. But subsequently in the Vedic periods after them, you have, and from then on, you have less fundamental change of who's ruling. So I'm just gonna list. You see all these different people and kingdoms, and ultimately the fundamental core of India stays the same, and that really is because of the caste system. So during the Vedic to epic ages, you had a period of rulers that were regional states. You had monarchs, so kings, right? You even had a period of republics. And again, it fundamentally didn't change too much. Then you had Alexander the Great, who took over. Actually, you had Persia first. We'll put part of the Persian Empire. Right, so that you had essentially, which was that they were a tributary state. But what's interesting about Persia is that their whole function was not to change the day-to-day life of people. So that one's not so surprising. But then you had Alexander the Great, who conquered the Persian Empire, and then India. You do have a unifying India during this period where it brings it all into one full region. This is, it's ruled by Alexander the Great. It's autocratic rule. He wasn't really there though. But again, fundamentally didn't change a lot about India other than being exposed to some Western ideas, which you could argue that this period did have some change in women's views. Remember I mentioned that this is the one area where you see acceptable change. Being exposed to the Greeks, the Macedonian Greeks, the role of women, you do have, during the Hellenistic period, an increase in women's status and role. And we do see transition in India where women are started to look with a more positive outlook. And then after Alexander the Great, you have regional kingdoms. And here and this is all from like the time period of ancient India that we were talking about. You have the Mauryan dynasty. One of the things that is unique during this period is you have the king Ashoka. And the only reason he stands out really is that he practiced Buddhism, not Bubism. and that was unique to have a ruler shift to emphasize Buddhism in India, but didn't directly challenge the caste system outside of that. It gave some people an opportunity spiritually. So he's mentioned because he often is unique in that sense of having a smaller impact or an impact more than others because of that religious shift. Or even Buddhism was already there, but putting an emphasis on it. He revoked violence and warfare after some horrible battles where he was expanding India, and converted to Buddhism and focused his life that way. And so then it ended up being a period of peace and prosperity. But the day-to-day lives of Indians didn't change at all, because again, they're still locked into this caste system. The Kushan state, the Guptas, and the Huns, right? So you have all of these regional rulers. The point of this list, again, is just to show you that even when you have all these different political structures or rulers, right, they kind of function as an outside force. Or outside of that, there's the caste system and Indian culture, economics, and politics within the caste system. And then there's that outer political structure that only slightly impacts what the ecosystem of the caste system is doing. Okay, that's where we're going to end. The next lecture, we're going to look at China with the Shang dynasty.